fill up, and it is filling up, so that's great. Go up a little bit. Wonderful. Okay, it's 12:01. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and editorial director of our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am very excited to be hosting this very important conversation today on the impact of this week's midterm elections on Washington foreign policy. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are a transpartisan think tank dedicated to bringing more realism and restraint to U.S. foreign policy, which means challenging the current internationalist consensus, which is predicated on U.S. military primacy and endless interventionism abroad at the expense of American interests at home and peace and prosperity abroad. As we all know, the midterm results are hardly what we expected. When we planned this panel some 2 weeks ago, we took for granted that there would be a red wave with Republicans picking up dozens of new House seats and perhaps even control of the Senate. As of this moment, the House control is not yet decided, though it is still looking like Republicans may take control of the House by a slim margin. The Senate picture is still in toss-up territory. So what does this mean for foreign policy? While many of us have spent nearly every waking moment over the last 8 months obsessing with the events in Ukraine, that war was nowhere near the ballot on Tuesday. In fact, it didn't even qualify as a question on any exit polls that I saw. Not surprisingly, the top issues for voters were the economy and inflation as they checked off their preferred candidates. But the issue of how the Biden administration is conducting U.S. foreign policy in the wake of the Russian invasion, which includes nearly $70 billion in U.S. humanitarian aid and weapons, has permeated the political debates on Capitol Hill and throughout the country. Polls have indicated that while the American people are committed to helping the Ukrainian people, their commitment has some limits. They want to see tools of diplomacy engaged, and they are worried about energy prices and inflation and don't want U.S. boots on the ground. On Capitol Hill, much of the criticism for Biden's policies have come from Republicans, from both populist new right conservatives like Matt Gaetz and Josh Hawley, and libertarian critics like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. More recently, House Leader Kevin McCarthy Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has suggested that a GOP-controlled House would be more circumspect over Ukraine aid, saying there won't be a, quote, blank check, particularly in light of the economic turmoil that Americans are experiencing at home. So that leads us to a few questions. Will the midterm elections herald in a new crop of new right conservatives who are less interested in the foreign policy of the past, dedicated in U.S. world-led order, undergirded by military intervention and democracy promotion abroad? Or will the new wing of the GOP, which is more in line, or with the old wing of the GOP, which is more in line with the hawkish Cold War ethos, take control of this new majority, squelching out any burgeoning restraint movement on the right? What will this mean for other foreign policy issues like China and Iran and Yemen and the future of NATO? Here to talk with me are some of the most astute political and foreign policy analysts around, and I'm very proud to have them here to break things down. I will introduce them each, and then we'll get right into questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Jacob Heilbrunn, who is the editor of the National Interest, the foreign policy magazine of the Center for the National Interest. Previously, he was a senior editor at The New Republic and an editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times. He has written on both foreign and domestic policy issues for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Reuters, Washington Monthly, and Weekly Standard. He has also written for German publications and is currently writing for, I believe, Spectator World. Rachel Bovard is Senior Director of Policy for the Conservative Partnership Institute in Washington. Beginning in 2006, she served in both the House and Senate in various roles, including as legislative committee under the successive chairmanships of Senator Pat Toomey and Senator Mike Lee. In the House, she worked as senior legislative assistant to Congressman Donald Manzullo and Congressman Ted Poe, and she also served as director of policy services for the Heritage Foundation. She serves on USA Today's Board of Contributors and is also the senior tech columnist for the Federalist. And last but not least, my colleague George Beebe, who is Director for Grant Strategy at the Quincy Institute. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as Director of the CIA's Russia analysis and as a staff advisor on Russia matters for Vice President Dick Cheney. In his book, The Russia Trap, How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, he warned how the United States and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. So I welcome you three to the panel, and I'm so excited for this conversation. So first, I'd like to ask each of you this question. What is your take on how the midterm results are shaping up right now? And do you believe, whether it was on the ballot or not, that the Ukraine war and how the Biden administration has been handling it has played into, at some level, how Americans feel about their own security and the direction of the country today? Let's start with Rachel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do think that foreign policy issues never sort of make it to the top of people's list, but I think exist at a very sort of important level under the surface. And I think kind of that's what you see here, especially because I do think that the divide on this issue between voters across the country and elected representatives in DC is actually quite stark. And, you know, it's become something of a totem in Washington right now to support, you know, Ukraine funding. Otherwise, you're a Putin supporter, right? So I think that there's very much of a moral element to this argument in Washington that you really don't see in the rest of the country. The rest of the country, I think, is, you know, dealing with basic economic issues, gas and grocery type issues, and isn't quite convinced or compelled about the interest the country has in engaging there. It doesn't mean they don't want to help people in Ukraine. It doesn't mean, you know, that they somehow want them to suffer in terrible ways. They definitely don't. But I do think, as a matter of where the U.S. government should be spending their resources and time, I think there is a pretty big divide here between the base and the elected representatives on both sides, actually.
Jacob?
I would slightly disagree with Rachel. I don't actually think that foreign policy, even on a subliminal level, played much of a role in this midterm, somewhat to my surprise. I was anticipating, falsely, it turns out, that there would be a stronger crop of Republicans, particularly in the Senate, who would be opposed to Ukraine funding. And it turns out that really it's probably J.D. Vance who will be the spear carrier on that front. But overall, I do not anticipate much change in the forthcoming Congress on the issue of Ukraine funding. And I thought House races and perhaps take over the Senate, making life miserable for Mitch McConnell. Kevin McCarthy, I saw as someone who actually doesn't believe himself in cutting off funding to Ukraine, but would have been compelled by the electoral results to move in that direction. So to me, the next 2 years looks like more of the same, but maybe George can tell me why I'm wrong.
That's your cue, George.
That's my cue. Well, I actually am going to take an unusual position on this and say that I think I agree with both Rachel and Jacob on this. I do believe there is a very substantial gap that has emerged over the course of several decades between where the center of gravity of the American people is and where the Washington establishment is when it comes to foreign policy, but also on a whole host of other issues as well. And this particular election, I don't think narrowed that gap any. I think that gap is still a pretty yawning one right now. But I also think that Jacob is correct. I don't think there are going to be big foreign policy implications from the results that we're still watching come in from this election. the numbers matter in all of this. And the numbers in the House are clearly not going to be overwhelming for the Republicans, even if they end up taking control of the House. And that has real implications for how much room for maneuver the White House might have on Ukraine funding. And I think it's interesting that the Russians waited until the day after the midterm elections to announce that they were withdrawing from Kherson. Clearly, this is something that they've been contemplating for some time. The fact that they chose to pull the trigger the day after the midterms suggests to me that Russia doesn't think there's going to be much implication for Ukraine funding from the midterm elections. And I think they're right on that.
That's a good point, George. But I want to go back to something that Jacob raised in terms of the new crop of Republicans, and you suggested that you're not seeing the sort of new right, restrainer, America first contingent, at least in the numbers that were anticipated. Rachel, what do you say about that? Is it a mixed bag, or are you disappointed? I mean, can you give us a picture of who, if there is a bigger group of those type of new right members who might start to make a noise about foreign policy once they get in, or did this election sort of tamp a little bit of that down?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm disappointed, with kind of how everything has come out. Although I think, you're still seeing some races be counted. But, I think pulling back broadly on the issue of whether or not this election was some kind of referendum on the new right, I think the new right's still figuring out what it is, first of all. And I think it's still very much an intellectual project. It hasn't quite manifested yet, I think, in a political way that has a lot of power. But that being said, I think the on the intellectual side, these ideas are infusing kind of into the right in ways that we haven't seen before. But I think to make that matter, then yeah, you do need votes, right? You do need people that are committed, not just rhetorically to these things, but you need people who are willing to go to the Senate floor to, use the power that exists in that chamber in particular to slow these things down, to, put a fork in the ground or a stake in the ground and say, I'm not moving until I get X, or until you do Y. And we simply just don't have that right now. And I will say too, something I think that is often underappreciated, especially on issues like this, is just the way this town is set up. The incentives are very difficult for members to do that on this issue in particular, on foreign policy in particular. And I've spoken about this before, but just based on my own experience, when I was handling these issues for Senator Rand Paul, it was unlike any other issue I ever saw, because to oppose the concentrated amount of interest around this in Washington, it's the bricks that fall on your head are from everywhere. You have the Pentagon showing up on the Hill, you have the intel agencies, you have the press working overdrive, not just your own leadership. So to change how foreign policy operates in Washington, D.C., I think requires not only a critical mass of members, but of members with a specific type of disposition that are willing to withstand that intense pressure that comes to bear on these issues in ways that don't exist in other sort of issue areas.
So with if there is a slim majority, we don't know yet, if there is a slim Republican majority in the House come January, how will that help the new right, populist, restrainer Republicans who are there, existing, new ones? How will it, or will, like I referred to in my opening remarks, will they be sort of sidelined by the leadership? I mean, you know the mechanics of these things.
Yeah, I think this is something to watch, because I think it, depending on how it all plays out, it could be very interesting if you have a Republican House and if you have even a very slim majority, a Republican in the Senate. Republicans are now the ones writing these bills, right? They are the ones writing the spending bills. And I think for anyone interested in making changes here, there has to be an expectation that the bills themselves are going to look different. And if McCarthy is convinced, because you have that very narrow majority, if he is convinced to go in a more restrainer direction, the opposition that he faces at that point, I actually think is his own party. I think it's Mitch McConnell, if McConnell is in the leadership in the Senate. It's not Chuck Schumer, it's not Democrats, it's actually McConnell, who has, I think, been very committed to continuing funding on these issues. So, you know, it's a very entrenched issue, but I think the people need to start iterating on this now, and laying the expectation down that if what change actually looks like, are these appropriations bills looking different, right? And it actually, the supplemental package is looking different. And it's not simply, oh, we're going to do oversight of the money. We're going to do a chain of custody argument for the weapons that we're sending. No, it's actual dollar amounts being reduced. And I haven't quite seen that message come together, but that's the expectation that should be laid down if that's what they have.
George is trying to get in.
Quick comment. I agree with Rachel. I think the foreign policy position of the Republican Party is in some sort of transition period. There's a tension between what you might call the Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Liz Cheney wing of the party, which is, you know, quite traditionalist, peace through strength approach to the world, and the new right, which is much more oriented toward a foreign policy for the middle class. Are we making Americans safer? Are we making Americans more prosperous as a result of our approach to the world? And how that is going to play out, I think, is very much undecided. The dynamism, I think, within the party is represented by people like Ron DeSantis, governor in Florida, J.D. Vance, the new senator from Ohio, Josh Hawley, which is very much in line with a foreign policy for the middle class approach. Whether they're going to be able to translate this dynamism, these new ideas, into a new direction for the party as a whole, I think is very much unclear right now.
Jacob, would you like to weigh in on this?
Well, there's one name that George conspicuously did not mention, and I'm all the more surprised since he is a denizen of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, who is, I've had my eye on for a while, and I think is definitely going to run for the presidency. And my guess is that either he or DeSantis would be Solomonic and attempt to split they would be for splitting the baby in half. I don't think that you're going to see, unless Trump wins the nomination, which he could, I don't think you'll see a resurgence of the all-out America first that Trump espoused. I think that these other candidates are going to mute that. They're going to sand off the edges, just as they're going to try and sand off the edges on domestic policy in the attempts of wooing swing voters. That's definitely the lesson, if there is a lesson, of this midterm. So I'm surprised, actually, I have to say, at how pessimistic the tone of this conversation is. Maybe I'm just a glass half water full guy, but to me, the surprising thing isn't the weakness of the restrainer movement, but how much it has become part of the identity of the GOP and is represented in Washington, D.C. itself. I think we're losing historical perspective here, which is that 6 or 10 years ago, the ideas that the Quincy Institute represents or other realists were nowhere to be found at all. So to me, the restrainer movement is going to be one of the most interesting stories of the next 2 years, and the intellectual and the attempts it makes to become and sustain itself as a movement in the Republican Party. So, you know, I think people have, in retrospect, become, you know, a little infatuated or intimidated by the perceived power of what neoconservatism was, not thinking about how much of a fluke the whole thing was. To me, the restrainer movement actually looks surprisingly substantial in Washington.
So if I can respond to that, because I think it's a great point about the point about historical perspective is spot on. You know, when, again, just speaking from my own experience, when Senator Paul got to Washington and started talking about this, it was insane, right? He was like decried as a lunatic because it was just so unusual. And I think that there is more of a consensus, but I would say that where I think, Jacob, you're right, that I think the intellectual energy is on the side of the restrainers. I would say the institutional power is still on the side of the neoconservative movement. And I think there's a lot of money and power behind that's difficult to contend with. And I think it's structurally reflected right now in the way the House and the Senate operate on these issues. Particularly when you're writing these, these supplementals or defense appropriations bills, and you don't even have participation from the broader membership. It's just a handful of members writing it, that's reflecting a very specific viewpoint. So I think the next step for the restraint movement is they need to start, again, it comes back to members, right? But they have to start taking that intellectual energy and building sort of an institutional capacity within the House and Senate around it. And that's what we're missing.
Yeah, I think one other thing, if I can just jump in quickly, is that we shouldn't extrapolate from current trends. We're all assuming that the Ukraine war is going to drag on for another year or two. It may not. I mean, the Russians are in terrible shape.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if within 6 months, there is some kind of a peace settlement between the two sides, which each depicts as a victory for themselves. I don't think that the US would let Kiev march into Crimea. With the Russian retreat now, the Chinese essentially weighing in and saying that they do not want Russia to use nuclear weapons. I think the nuclear weapons card has largely shriveled, not completely in Russia. So we could be facing a new situation. The restrainer movement, such as it is, will have to deal with both not just ideological questions, but also practical foreign policy issues.
Very quickly on this, I agree with you, Jacob. I think the prospects for a peace settlement actually look much brighter today than they did even a few weeks ago. And that will pose some interesting dilemmas, I think, for some of the new right members of Congress. Because on the one hand, what's going to happen is the United States is probably going to have to make some hard decisions about, are we going to ease economic sanctions on Russia in order to incentivize important Russian concessions? What is our position going to be on some sort of an agreement on Ukraine's potential NATO membership? These are issues in which I think philosophically, some of the new right members of the Republican Party are going to be pushing in a direction that the Biden administration might find congenial. And so politics and policy might actually come into a little bit of a tension for some of the new Republican members there. And it'll be interesting to watch what happens on that. The second thing I'll say here, one of the names that we haven't mentioned here is Donald Trump. And I think Donald Trump actually was the biggest loser of the midterm elections. And that, I think, is probably a good thing for the cause of new right Republican foreign policy, because they are not going to have to cope with all of the baggage that comes with association with Trump in the way that they might have had a lot of the Trump-backed candidates won on Wednesday. And so we may well see a movement that depends much more on ideas than it does on personality. And I think that's probably a good thing in the long run for the strengths of the new right.
I was actually, that was going to be my next question to Jacob, was either the influence of, or maybe not, of Donald Trump over the course of the next few years and in 2024. Will it embolden the restraint movement, or will it suck the life out of it? That's my first question. My second question, I guess that it just was spurred by what George had been talking about. You know, Ron DeSantis got a big boost from the midterms, the results, riding high. And there's a Washington Post article up today saying, is the world ready for President DeSantis and a Floridian foreign policy? And I said, well, this is great, because I haven't really gotten a great sense of where Ron DeSantis is on foreign policy. But it doesn't look quite good for restrainers. It talks about, I'm scrolling it down right now, but he had condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and was critical of President Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. Also strongly opposed to traditional US foes like Iran, notably opposing the nuclear deal with that country, as well as newer rivals like China, has pledged to be the most pro-Israel governor in America. He did side with Elon Musk recently when he took a lot of heat for suggesting a peace plan between Russia and Ukraine. But, you know, I'd love to hear each of you, starting with Jacob, you know, what about the Trump factor? And where do we go with, say, a Ron DeSantis standard bearer for the party?
Well, there is no conclusive answer to the Trump factor. My guess is, you know, the Wall Street Journal editorial page denounced him today. The New York Post called him Trumpty Dumpty on the cover. There's a lot of the Trump critics are emerging now from within the GOP to denounce him for having essentially shackled the party in the midterm elections. I mean, I guess the candidates that he did endorse in the House, all 5 lost. And he obviously I think he helped blow Pennsylvania. There's no way that David McCormick, I'm quite confident David McCormick would have won that seat in Pennsylvania. But, you know, it's going to be, a lot of people are going to beat on Trump and blame him solely for this defeat, which probably isn't fair either. I mean, the Democrats clearly conducted a better campaign than people had anticipated. But Trump over the next 2 years, no, my guess is that he will be indicted by the Justice Department. They will have less inhibitions after this midterm about the political consequences. You know, if Trump was denied the nomination, I could see him running, though, as a third party candidate to try and stop a Republican from winning. His influence on foreign policy, I think, will be lasting in the GOP. I don't think it's temporary. The restrainer movement may not be dominant in the GOP, but it is going to make life miserable for Kevin McCarthy. The Freedom Caucus is already targeting McCarthy right now. So I think we're going to have a battle royale in the Republican Party over foreign and domestic policy.
Rachel, do you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I completely agree that there's a lot of tension right now, particularly among House Republicans, about how this is going to go forward. And I think given how narrow the majority might be, it does give, just as a simple matter of, you know, leverage, some power to people that want to push the party in the restraint direction. And I'm eager and happy to see that. You know, as for Donald Trump, I've long since given up prognosticating on how Trump will impact things. I think he's just such a wild card. And, you know, I think, just as an aside, you know, witnessing today the same thing Jacob did, all of these, you know, editorial pages coming out against him. I will say, I don't think the Wall Street Journal editorial board necessarily speaks for the Trump base voter. And in fact, it might have the opposite effect, right? Of the Wall Street Journal saying, don't like Trump, that might make them love Trump more, but we'll see. But I do think that, yes, he has singularly altered a lot of the trajectory of Republicans on the issue of foreign policy. I think he made it okay, you know, for a lot of Republicans to say, whoa, wait a second, you know, neoconservatism may have been a really bad swerve, and we need to reorient. And I think he made it okay too, that this isn't a movement of isolationism, right? I think he created the space for a lot of intellectual ferment here. And I think that's very significant. And I think it didn't just, it was sort of a realignment in both parties, because you now have a lot of what were traditionally, historically, democratic skepticism, right, of foreign entanglements now taking place on the right, where you almost have Democrats now in lockstep moving toward some of the foreign policy goals that we've seen in Ukraine. Now, again, a little bit of this is because I think there's a Democratic president, but it's significant what you saw when the Progressive Caucus attempted to issue some form of dissent on this issue and was just roundly smacked down for doing so. And that I was very surprised to see, but I think it just speaks to kind of the realignment on this issue that's still taking place. But again, I will come back to my constant thesis, which is I do think that while there is a lot of cause for optimism, the structural incentives on Capitol Hill are all still leaning in the neocon direction. And I think that needs to be a focus now. And it's not just talking points, it's also the disposition and willingness of members to go to the mat on these issues and to form the coalitions, the political coalitions on Capitol Hill necessary to do so.
I want to follow up on that, but before I do, I'm being told the New York Times now projects that that Kent will win the House seat in Washington, and he is a new right restrainer. He's been very vocal about U.S. foreign policy. He's a veteran, so he has, he is very much committed, I believe, to changing the foreign policy away from irresponsible interventionism. So he's, I guess, one for the restraint side. I wanted to ask you, Rachel, because we're talking about like the structural challenges to restrainer Republicans moving forward. Is there any way around that? I'm thinking now of major media, social media, the way that Trump was able to harness a lot of that power during his own campaign and beyond in terms of end running traditional media, traditional like the establishment and the elites. And, he was able not only to get a message out, but just to actually promote particular policies and, messaging without having to, fall under the sway or challenge of those institutional constraints. Is there a way for these restrainers? I mean, Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, I think it's a much wider media world we're in now, right? With social media, kind of moving away from the traditional institutions. You do see, very popular television hosts embracing some of the stuff which is new and different. But I think for the members themselves, they have to take the message to the floor. They have to take the message to the floor through votes as well. I think nothing is more powerful than creating an institutional record around some of these issues, because right now, if you look at how defense bills are considered, and I'm talking about sort of policy bills like NDAA and also appropriations bills, it's just one and done. Right. There is very little debate on a lot of these questions, or if there is, it's, structured so it's just around like one or two issues. So I think they have to be prepared to, again, like build that coalition to force these issues to the floor, and where necessary, force votes, because there's nothing more clarifying to members than actually having to put their name behind something on a vote, right? It's easy to sign the letter. It's easy to like read the talking points, but when you're actually forced to vote on the question, that's a lot harder. And that's I think where we need to start to see some clarification around a lot of these questions.
Well, why don't we drill down a little bit on specific issues that perhaps, restrainers on both sides of the aisle could work on. And I'm thinking one of these things is the Yemen war powers resolution that was very effective, I believe in 2018. It passed Congress, vetoed by President Trump, but the resolution has been resurrected and it has bipartisan support. I don't know if any of you would like to weigh in on this, but is there any chance for those kinds of efforts where you have Republicans and Democrats aligning on an issue in which they're basically saying we want to take our congressional authority back for waging wars, and particularly on Yemen, where This war has gone on for 7 years, mostly due to the assistance that the United States has given to Saudi Arabia, not exactly in good stead with politicians on Capitol Hill right now. Are there opportunities where restrainers can sort of break that logjam on their perspective by joining forces with the other side? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think that a bipartisan interest is always powerful, right? Particularly when, even when you are sort of opposing your own leadership on both sides, in the Senate in particular, you have the ability to get those things to the floor, right? So I think that bipartisan element is always powerful. I think we're in sort of a poisonous partisan moment, so that makes cooperation on those things difficult, but doesn't mean it can't happen.
It's interesting, Kelly. I mean, it's an interesting point you made, because in a sense, probably approaching it as an explicit restrainer issue is a political mistake. You would have to present it as a moral
or a constitutional issue.
Yeah, but also as a moral, because of the U.S. difficulties with Saudi Arabia do present an opening. That's the kind of issue where people may become too nauseated to continue all-out cooperation with the Saudis, given the way that they've been treating the United States. I wonder what George thinks about that.
Well, I think there is growing sentiment to not cater to the Saudis in Yemen or in other issues, largely because of the frictions that have emerged, not just over Saudi Arabia's human rights performance, but also its clear thumbing of its nose against the United States on the question of oil production. So my guess is that there's significant sentiment on both sides of the aisle that's fairly anti-Saudi right now. But when it comes to war powers and reasserting congressional prerogatives over war, that has not tended to be driven by particular policy preferences. It's more a function of the relative weakness or strength of the executive overall. During periods when the executive has been weak, Congress has tended to reassert its own powers. And at other times, I think Congress has basically been content to take a back seat. I don't see right now as being a period where Congress is really feeling its oats and really looking to yank a lot of power back that has moved over to the executive in the past several decades.
The real problem, George, is that, as you know, Congress has abdicated on every possible issue, including just passing a budget. It's not confined to foreign policy. They don't want to take stands on anything.
That's right. Now this is where this is an interesting question, because people like J.D. Vance, Joe Kent, for example, these are people that seem to have a tremendous amount of political backbone. Both of them have been willing to stand up and buck conventional wisdom quite blatantly. And whether that sort of fortitude is contagious within Congress, and whether they show it when they're actually in Congress or not, is going to be an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, I totally agree. And and I just wanted to remind the viewers that if you have a question for Q&A, I can take them as we go along. And we do have a question from Ann Money. I hope I didn't mispronounce your last name. She asked, do you see a possibility of restrainer Republican and Democratic representatives and or senators working together on Ukraine? Rachel, you had brought up the letter by the Progressives caucus that caused such a stir a couple weeks ago. There does seem to be a ton of political tension, as there always is around an election. But as the dust settles after the election, do you think that there are opportunities between the restrainers on either side, or are they too divided on their motivations and their political realities to get together and sort of force the issue together?
You have seen this in the past, odd pairings like, Mike Lee and Bernie Sanders, or Chris Murphy and a Rand Paul. Like it does happen, and particularly on, war powers resolutions and things like that, which, when you are forcing action in a chamber, I think it always helps to have sort of bipartisan buy-in on doing that, because again, as George mentioned, like they hate taking stands on these things, or Jake, maybe it was Jacob that mentioned it. Like they hate these having to stand behind something, which again is why I think the best thing that the restrainers can do is force as many votes as possible, right? Like make people own these policy choices. And the only way you do that in a self-government is through voting, essentially, right? So, what I do think is difficult is this political moment is just so toxic. I've seen on a number of issues, Democrats who say they don't want to work with insurrectionists and vice versa, right? You always get this sort of, where you would normally see the power in building a bipartisan political coalition, it's poisoned by, I don't want to be associated. It's with this person or that person for whatever. And I think ultimately the grown-up take on this is that you're going to have to link arms with the P. If you care about this issue, then, and if you actually are interested in engaging in a political power struggle to solve it, you are going to have to link arms with people you might not otherwise. And that, guys, that's the essence of politics as it stands anyway. So I would hope we could move beyond that, but we'll see.
What about the Heritage Foundation? I'm sorry, George, do you want to two-finger that?
Well, yeah, I think the prospects for bipartisan cooperation on things like Ukraine are not, enormously bright, but I think there's more of an opportunity for that than there was even a few months ago. So although I wouldn't necessarily predict, a great degree of cooperation, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more of it. Now, why is that? I think we're moving into a phase of this conflict in Ukraine where there's going to be a lot more focus on diplomacy and less on, are we providing the Ukrainians everything they need to defend themselves? And that's an issue where some of the new right members of Congress might actually see eye to eye with where the Biden administration will need to go on diplomacy. But the other part about this that I think makes me a little more optimistic about cooperation is, again, that Trump factor. He personally has been so toxic for many members of the Democratic Party, as well as in the Republicans, that the prospect of cooperating in any way with a party that's associated with him is just anathema. If his star actually is waning, then I think the qualms that some might have on the Democratic side of the aisle of linking arms with some Republicans might be somewhat reduced. We'll have to see.
Thanks, George. Rachel, I wanted to ask you about the Heritage Foundation, and I know you worked for them in the past, and I'm not asking you to talk out of school or anything, but in recent months, Mr. Murphy, I believe Kevin Murphy, the executive director?
Kevin Roberts, yeah.
Roberts, I'm sorry. Roberts has come out and he has criticized, but I guess he has criticized the Ukraine aid, and that he didn't feel that Congress was able to put as much oversight over the aid. I don't believe that he's called for no more aid or retracting the aid in any way, but he has talked a little bit more restraint language over the past several months, which has surprised folks on both sides. And there seems to be some anticipation that maybe Heritage might be looking more in the new right camp on foreign policy than they ever had been in the past. Can you shed some light on whether maybe these restrainers on the right could expect maybe some institutional support from Heritage, even if it's just on the Ukraine aid issue?
Yeah, I do think, Dr. Kevin Roberts took over the Heritage Foundation, I think, a year or so ago at this point, and has instituted a number of changes there. And I think what you're seeing happen is Heritage responding to where the movement is, right? And I think that's very smart. They recognize that this is now something what the conservative movement reflects. That I think for a long time they represented a very sort of Reagan-esque foreign policy, of what they would call strength and all this kind of stuff. And I think they still stand for that. But I think they're also recognizing that the conservative movement, lives in this new reality where, we're not fighting the Cold War again. We're fighting on a number of different fronts. So do I think the Heritage Foundation is ever going to be 100% in the restraint camp? I do not. But I do think that, I'm heartened, I think, to see them engaging in these fights. And I think where we can ally with them, I'm not someone who says, well, because of your priors, you cannot be in our coalition. Like, I welcome you into this coalition, and I hope that we can, Heritage is a massive institution on the right. Any support that they want to give to these arguments, I think is very welcome, in light of, again, what I've pointed out as I think the institutional imbalances are, particularly on Capitol Hill.
I'd be remiss not to bring up China in this conversation. And I realize that for restrainers, particularly on the right, is a bit of a third rail, in that we don't all agree with one another on how to respond to China. And it's, in a competitive security challenge. And we have everybody from John Mearsheimer, who is a conservative realist, who does believe that in this case that the United States should have a more aggressive policy when it comes to China competition, all the way over to, folks even at Quincy who believe that the restraint that we are applying in Ukraine should be transferred to China and everyone in between. So if we're just looking at the Republicans and restrainers, America First, populist restrainers on the right, how is there a coming split over this issue? Because however long the Ukraine issue is protracted, you still have this simmering situation in China that does not seem to be cooling down any, and a lot of people getting a little nervous about some of the rhetoric coming out of the administration over Taiwan. So where do restrainers land on this, and how do we keep together as an effort, as a movement?
I'm going to let the smart guys start with that question.
Here, I'm gonna give the opposite view of Mearsheimer, who I think he has it backwards. I think the China threat is vastly overblown, and I think it in many ways because of its internal problems. I do not think it's going to surpass the United States. It's wrecking its economy right now. It has an aging population, tremendous environmental problems, overbuilt real estate sector. Now, the most you could argue is that would prompt them to embark upon expansionism to disguise their domestic weaknesses. I suppose you could make that argument. I don't think they're marching into Taiwan tomorrow. That's tougher, a tougher military problem or conundrum to solve than marching into Ukraine. I think the Chinese have shown themselves to be fairly cautious and careful. Mr. Putin, by contrast, I think restrainers have underestimated him. Seems to me it isn't China that's a problem. Russia, under Putin, has behaved far more recklessly. And Mr. Putin has imploded. In a sense, he's done the US a favor. But the Russia-China debate, I would just say it seems wholly backwards to me. George, over to you.
Well, I think China is probably an issue that's going to be particularly contentious in realist circles. because there are those that believe that this is an issue that can be handled quite well through diplomacy and traditional counterbalancing, that there's no reason that this has to become a military conflict between Russia and China if we handle this deftly. And then there are those that believe very much in the peace through strength, that we have got to show the Chinese quite clearly that we can defeat China in a cross-straits scenario, and that we are willing to go to war to defend Taiwan, and that sending those kinds of messages to Beijing will in fact prevent war. And this is not an issue that is easily lends itself to a big tent. These are quite serious divisions. They're not really compatible with one another. I think the most you could say here is that those that believe the United States ought to have some sort of military buildup in the Pacific might find adherence to some degree in both camps. But I think this is going to be quite a divisive matter.
Let me just pile on, George. I am convinced that you will create the very scenario that we're trying to avoid by attempting to behave aggressively towards China. Yes, you can build up militarily to counter them, but the idea that we are going to embark upon some kind of crusade against China or even regime change, the exaggeration of the China threat, which is focused on Taiwan. Yes, they're a threat to Taiwan, but again, I don't think they're marching in there. You're going to create a nightmare scenario if you behave in an extremely hawkish fashion towards China. I simply don't see it. It's kind of mind-boggling to me because, I mean, we underestimated what Russia would do, but then we grossly overestimate what the Chinese are prepared to do.
An even more contentious issue on this is going to be the economic relationship, the trade relationship between the West and China as well. And this is one that I think is going to be very contentious within the new right. There are going to be those that look at China, the degree to which the American economy has outsourced manufacturing to China, made itself dependent on supply chains, which have in turn endangered Americans physically and economically, and say, we need to move toward decoupling. But there will, of course, be rather severe economic repercussions for that if it's not handled very, very deftly. And we could find a situation where the prosperity of Middle America is endangered if we don't handle this very, very well. I think these are going to be quite difficult and contentious issues.
Rachel?
Yeah, I was going to bring up the point that I think George just made very deftly, which is, what in my conversations with members, there's like two ways to look at China. And I think in reality, these two things are linked, but as a matter of consideration, they're often considered separately, which is sort of the military approach to China and then the economic entanglement side of the domestic policy toward China. And again, I think these two things bounce off each other in practice, but in the minds of members that I talk to, they're almost separate issues. And I think there's a lot of interest in, untangling our economic relationship with China, but no one's quite figured out how to do it without disrupting, our economy at so many levels, from the financial sector down to the manufacturing sector is so tied in with China. So how do you do that in the least disruptive way? And I think, those conversations are ongoing, and I think may come to define how the new right's approach to foreign and economic policy looks, even more so than the Russia question, I think.
Rachel brought up a good point there, if I can just piggyback on it, which is the economic ties with China and the difficulty of severing them. I think the Biden administration actually is, in the national security front, been moving to try and protect, vital American industries. I also think they're trying to stop them from acquiring sensitive American assets on the military front. And then finally, this total lockdown policy in China that Xi Jinping is willfully following is wrecking his own economy. I think the Chinese, in their own way, maybe this isn't deliberate, it's inadvertent, but they're wrecking their own economy. And a lot of American businesses have realized that maybe the future is not in China economically. Now, that will present its own forms of societal upheaval in China, but I'm starting to feel more bullish about our position relative to China.
Yeah, I think where the difficulties arise is particularly for members on the Hill is when budget time rolls around. And as you know, particularly in the national security defense sphere, you have the messaging is all about how do we compete with China. And so all of the military forces are out trying to outdo themselves in terms of their requests for new weapons, for new technology. You have people in think tanks all over Washington who are pushing for more money, in order to compete. And what is worrisome is that these real important conversations and the nuance of how, the relationship with China should develop, and talking about the economic and the military challenges get lost when it's all about the top line, and members don't want to be seen as being soft on China. So they acquiesce to budgets that are way out in the stratosphere, because if they don't, they won't be competing with China. And so I think that's something that we really need to look at to see if conservatives, Republicans are able to hold the line, or at least put up a little bit of resistance during budget time, as instead of falling sway to the orthodoxy and also, the defense contracting lobby. And we had a question, and I'm sorry if I don't get the name, in the chat, asking about how do Republicans resist the military industrial complex. And as you know, if the Republicans take over the House, that means really important House committee shifts, House Armed Services Committee, Foreign Relations. But typically, people like Mike Rogers and Mike McFaul are very hawkish, and they get a lot of money from, the defense industry. So how insurmountable is that in terms of the influence of the hawkish defense military complex on conservative Republicans? Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I think it's a mistake to confine it to Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely. But
what is
majority as well?
The debates used to be in the Democratic Party. It's quite amazing about cutting military spending, and that seems to have gone by the wayside. Which is, I guess, the question I would have for both Rachel and George would be, what's the actual political incentive for the Republican Party to jettison the hawkishness that it has essentially followed since the 1950s, at least on the right? I mean, the standard political line has been that Democrats are weak, soft, and appeasing Americans' enemies. And that's the line that Mike Pompeo will take. That's the line that Robert O'Brien will take. That obviously has been the dominant credo in the Republican Party. I think it's a heavy lift for the party to totally jettison that. That would mean ceding that ground to the Democrats. Is that plausible for the GOP?
Great question.
I think that, at least from where I sit, I think that the political payoff has yet to be made, right? Or for it to be in their interest, I think they're still trying to figure that out. I don't think it is right now. So much money comes in for the members that write these bills, and there's so much institutional power behind them to write them in the way that they do. I do think that the conservative base is not quite in lockstep with that thoroughly anymore, but I think it's going to take a few more election cycles to figure that out, right? And I think also there's never been a counterpoint on the right to those arguments, and you're finally starting to see members that will make counter arguments, which I think is going to be helpful in sort of breaking at least the sort of stranglehold that one view has, one point of view. The Republicans have only one point of view on this issue. The more members that we get into office, like, Senator-elect Vance, like Joe Kent, that are going to start to make, rhetorically at least, and hopefully with process, the argument for why it doesn't have to be this way, and show that you can still win with those arguments, that's the only way you're going to start to turn the ship on this stuff, I think. But I don't think the political case has been made yet.
Well, I guess I would say that that argument about being soft on our enemies had a lot of resonance during the Cold War in a bipolar world. That world is gone. It was replaced temporarily by a unipolar world in which the bulk of the U.S. foreign policy establishment believed that the United States had unrivaled power and could do things in the world to make the world better, to change the world, to transform other countries into democracies, into more stable, more orderly countries. That, in fact, didn't work very well. Our efforts to transform the world, for the most part, failed and were counterproductive. We're now heading into a multipolar world, and I think Americans are asking increasingly, should the purpose of American foreign policy be to change the world, or should it be to make Americans better off? Should we have a foreign policy geared toward the safety and prosperity of America's middle class? And I think those are the voices that are on the ascent over time. And I don't think anybody is ever going to say America should be soft, that we shouldn't have a robust ability to defend ourselves. But I do think that a lot of people are going to be saying, hey, let's not orient foreign policy toward changing the world. Let's orient our foreign policy around making sure America and Americans are better off.
Well, thank you, George. I think that was a really positive way to wrap up this conversation. And so I appreciate it. Thank you, Jacob, Rachel, and George. I just wanted to say for those still listening that we have two amazing Quincy Institute events over the next couple days. Tomorrow for Veterans Day, we have our chairman of the board, Andrew Basevich, talking to a fantastic slate of recent Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans about their paths of descent. This is part of a book that was just published by Andrew Basevich, and veterans talking about their service and their rethinking of U.S. foreign policy in the global war on terror. So go to quincyinst.org to check out the link for that event. It starts at 1 o'clock tomorrow, Friday. And then on Monday, we have a mega conference going on. Is America ready for a multipolar world? This is Monday, November 14th, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. We have an amazing slate of former and present government officials, scholars, international experts ahead of the G20, which begins next week as well. So check out quincyinst.org for all the information and the link to that event on Monday. And thank you so much for everybody that came here to listen. Sorry we didn't get to your questions in the Q&A, and thanks to our amazing panelists for your participation.